Hey guys, welcome back. We are entering one of my favorite times to be in the deer woods, the pre-rut. This is the time of year, the pre-rut, when a lot of those older bucks that are using your property and that are around the neighborhood, which have been moving around mostly at night up until this point, are going to start moving more consistently during daylight, giving you more shot opportunities. So in this video, I want to talk to you guys about a few strategies for hunting the pre-rut. But before we talk about the hunting strategies that we like to focus on during the pre-rut, first I want to talk about what the deer are doing during this part of the season. That way, when we do talk about our hunting tips and strategies, you'll better understand how you can use those to better gain an advantage based on what the deer are doing this time of year. And the first thing I want to touch on when we're talking about the pre-rut and the rut for that matter is that the pre-rut and the rut will take place at the same time at your property every single season. Regardless of moon phase, regardless of temperature, regardless of anything, the pre-rut and the rut are going to take place at the same time every single year on your property. And for us here in mid-Michigan, that's generally around the 20th to the 24th of October. If your property is a little bit north, you might notice the pre-rut starting a little bit sooner. And if your property is a little bit further south, you might notice the pre-rut starting a little bit later. Now, there are factors that influence daylight movement, such as weather, moon phase, hunting pressure. So just remember that the pre-rut is going to take place at the same time on your property every single year. The timing of the pre-rut and the rut is based off of the diminishing daylight as we push through the fall. So again, that remains consistent year to year. So just make a mental note as to when the pre-rut and the rut kicks off on your property, because that should remain consistent every single year. But now let's talk about what the deer or the bucks are doing during the pre-rut. And to understand that, we also need to understand what the deer are doing during the rut. And during the rut, it's really not that complicated. During the rut, the bucks, they're really trying to breed as many does as possible. So during the pre-rut, they are really just trying to get ready for the rut. This is the time of year where bucks are building strength. They're trying to figure out where these doe groups are hanging out, and they're laying down a ton of sign. Think about the pre-rut as kind of a scouting phase prior to the rut. And these older bucks in the neighborhood, they've experienced that rut before, so they know what's coming. And remember, during the rut, they're trying to breed as many does as possible. They want to be the most efficient breeder that they can be. And there's a few fairly predictable ways that these bucks are scouting the doe family groups on your property and in the neighborhood. And these behaviors are what we want to be focusing on when we're trying to get opportunities at these bucks during the pre-rut. And two of the main ways that the neighborhood bucks are checking on or scouting the doe family groups that are on your property are, one, they are traveling downwind of where these doe family groups are, whether they're in their bedding areas or in their feeding areas. And two, these bucks are constantly checking on these major communication hubs. By frequently checking these communication areas and checking on where these does spend the most time, the bucks on and around your property are going to be able to determine where they should be focusing their efforts when the breeding season starts. But now let's talk about how we can use that information and develop a few hunting strategies based on what the bucks are doing this time of year. And the first one we're going to talk about is our morning hunting strategy. So remember, during this time of year, bucks are traveling along the downwind side of where these doe family groups are spending more time. And during the morning and throughout the day, these doe family groups are spending most of their time in the thick bedding cover. So during the pre-rut in the morning, while the deer are off feeding in those destination fields, the destination food source, whatever that might be in your area, we like to slip in and get closer to that bedding cover, setting up on the downwind side to try to catch the movement as the deer move from those feeding areas back to the bedding areas, and also try to catch those bucks as they're trying to sneak through the downwind side of that bedding cover. So again, one of our strategies for hunting during the pre-rut in the morning is by setting up just downwind of the trail that's just on the inside of the cover on the downwind side of those thick bedding areas. And again, this is because during the morning, a lot of times these bucks are cruising the downwind side of that doe bedding to check on those doe family groups. Our strategy for hunting during the afternoon is going to focus on the opposite end of that bed to feed pattern. During the morning and the early afternoon, those doe family groups are going to be spending time in those bedding areas, but in the late afternoon, early evening, they're going to be getting up to head towards that staging food source and eventually the destination food source. So we want to move back away from that destination food source, and we want to place our stand location either on the downwind side of that staging food source or on the downwind side of the trail leading from those bedding areas to that staging food source. Remember, during the pre-rut, the local bucks are going to be checking on, keeping tabs, scouting these doe family groups. And during the afternoon, the doe family groups are going to be moving towards that afternoon food source. By setting up on the downwind side of these smaller staging food sources, or on the downwind side of these trails that are leading from bedding to the staging food sources, we have a good opportunity at catching bucks as they are also cruising the downwind side checking for does. The next tip I want to touch on is one of my favorite strategies for hunting during the pre-rut, and it has to do with all of the deer sign that we're going to start seeing pop up throughout the woods, if you haven't seen it already. And it also has to do with the buck's behavior this time of year. Remember, they are frequently checking the areas that does frequent, and one of the things I mentioned earlier were these communication areas, or these perennial scrapes. Hunting over a perennial scrape, a primary scrape, a hub scrape is one of the best strategies for hunting during the pre-rut. And all these different names, they all mean the same thing. Everyone just has a different way of saying it. This just means that the scrape is in the same place on your property every single year. You are going to be seeing a lot of scrapes pop up this time of year during the pre-rut, during the rut, but not all scrapes are the same, and you should not be hunting over every single scrape. There are going to be annual scrapes or more random scrapes, and then there are those perennial scrapes, the scrapes that are in the same place every single year. The perennial scrapes are the scrapes that you want to be focusing on during the pre-rut. And the reason scrapes are so powerful during the pre-rut is because scrapes are one of the main ways deer communicate with one another. They're like a social network within the deer herd. Scrapes are like deer Facebook. One common misconception about scrapes is a lot of people think that scrapes are only used by bucks. And this makes sense because that's what we see when we watch a TV show or read a magazine. We see the bucks working the scrapes. But every single deer in the deer herd uses those scrapes. Does, fawns, all the deer on your property communicate with one another through those primary scrapes. When deer visit scrapes, they're leaving a lot of scent behind to communicate with the rest of the deer herd. And the best analogy that I can think of when trying to explain scrapes, and I use this one every year, but again, it's because I think it's one of the best ones, is the dog and the telephone pole or the fence post. When you take your dog for a walk or take him to the dog park, your dog always goes to the bathroom, always pees on that same telephone post or fire hydrant or fence post. And that's because your dog is communicating with the rest of the dogs in the neighborhood or at the dog park. And so when he or she smells that area, they're taking in information from all the previous dogs that have peed in that same spot. It's the very same thing with deer and scrapes. So if you're a buck during the pre-rut and you're trying to keep tabs or scout all these different doe family groups, and you're trying to figure out which does are close to coming into estrus and which does are not, along with keeping tabs on the competitors, the other local bucks in the area, one of the best locations that you can frequently check are these primary or perennial scrapes. So from a strategy standpoint, now we can start putting a few of these things together. In the morning, we want to be focusing on these primary or perennial scrapes that are located just on the downwind side of these doe bedding areas. And in the afternoon, we want to be focusing on these primary scrapes that are located either within that afternoon staging food source or along the trail that's located from the bedding to the afternoon food source. Identifying and then hunting along the downwind side of these primary scrapes is one of the better pre-rut hunting strategies. Another form of sign that you guys are going to start seeing more in the deer woods are rubs. And me personally, I don't place as much of a priority on rubs as I do those perennial scrapes, and I'll touch on that in just a minute. But one thing that we can sometimes use rubs to do is determine the direction a buck is traveling. And I'll kind of explain that now. So if we know where the food source is and we know where the bedding location is, like general direction, and when we know where there's a main travel corridor, we can often determine the direction the deer was traveling while he was traveling along that travel corridor. And what I mean is, I have a miscanthus screen right here. I have a food plot on the opposite side of that. And let's say I've got bedding cover behind the camera. If I have a travel corridor that leads from the food source to the bedding area, and I've got trees along the way, along that corridor, and every tree, there's rubs on every tree that's facing the food source, then that's likely the trail that deer was taking as he left the food source and went back to bed in the morning, his morning trail. And the opposite would be is if the rubs were on the opposite side of the tree. So if you have a trail that's leading from the bedding area to the food source, and you notice that there's several rubs in a row along that corridor and they all are facing the bedding area, then there's a decent chance that the buck used that trail in the afternoon as he got up from bed to head towards the food source. Now, this is far from an exact science. These are just indicators, things that you can use to try to help put the pieces together. Again, while I like finding rubs and they can sometimes help me determine the direction a buck might be traveling while using a certain trail, I don't normally base a hunting strategy based off of rubs I find. And the reason for that is because right now during the pre-rut and the rut, bucks are going to be laying down a lot of sign. And a lot of that sign is going to be random, meaning it's going to be in this location this year, and next year he might do it over there. The following year he might do it over there. And we don't really want to base a hunting strategy off of random sign, random rubs, random scrapes. We want to be basing strategy off of perennial sign, the sign that's in the same place on your property every year. Just to give you guys an example, and this scenario repeats itself every year, just in different locations. You know, we'll be walking around the woods, whether it's behind our pole barn or just behind your house, and we'll see rubs on trees, we'll see a scrape on the ground, but these scrapes are new. They're not scrapes that were there the year before or the year before that. It's new this year, and that's not a scrape that you want to be basing a hunt over, and that's because we have no idea why the buck made that scrape or that rub. The only thing that we do know is that a buck was there at one time. There are a lot of reasons why bucks are rubbing on trees or making scrapes this time of year. You could have two bucks in the same area. One of them's a little bit more dominant in either the dominant buck, you know, he starts making a rub or he starts scraping, or maybe they start kind of getting after it a little bit, and then the dominant buck pushes off the subordinate buck, and that subordinate buck just goes and finds a place. He starts letting off that frustration and starts rubbing on trees and starts making a bunch of scrapes. And if you're walking through the woods and you find that area where there's a bunch of scrapes made and a bunch of trees rubbed, definitely make note of where that's at, because you want to check that location next year. But that's not an area or a scenario, finding random sign that I'd want to be basing a hunting strategy over. Just remember, there is a big difference between perennial sign and random sign. If you do find a rub or a nice scrape in the woods, definitely make a note of it, mark it on your map so you can check it next year. But this year, focus on that perennial sign, those perennial scrapes, the scrapes that have been in the same place on your property every year. The next tip I have for you guys for hunting during the pre-rut is one that we touched on in a previous video, tips for hunting during warmer weather. But it's also relevant for hunting during the pre-rut, and that's focusing on a water source. Remember, during the pre-rut, these bucks are going to be moving a lot more, checking on or scouting these doe family groups. They're going to be hitting water sources more than usual. And this year, with the severe drought covering a lot of the Midwest, that's going to be more the case. The deer herd is going to be hitting those water sources much more than usual. And the bucks right now, they're going to be hitting it a lot because not only are we in a drought, but they are also going to be traveling a lot more. So again, if you can start putting a lot of these pieces together, you can have a dynamite stand location for the pre-rut. If you have a water source combined with a perennial scrape that's on the downwind side of doe bedding or along the trail leading from doe bedding to those food sources, that would be a great spot for the pre-rut. And the last thing I want to touch on in this video for hunting during the pre-rut is when should you be hunting? And this is not going to differ from any other time during the season. Is during the pre-rut, just like every other time of the year, we really like to time our hunts to cold fronts. And I'll do a whole video on cold fronts, kind of what we're looking for. But really, to sum it up here, really, we're trying to hunt once that front moves through, once that temperature drops, the barometric pressure rises, the wind speed dies down. After that front moves through, there's a higher probability that the deer are going to be on their feet moving, and this is when we want to be in the stand. And because we're in the pre-rut, I want to touch on one more thing as it relates to hunting post cold front. And not everyone's going to be able to do this because a lot of people work, but if you're able to time your hunt to immediately after that cold front, immediately after that rain stops, like be in the stand almost as it's raining, so you can be in the stand as the rain stops, you have a good chance of catching bucks as they get up from those bedding locations and go to those perennial scrapes to work those scrapes. Rain washes scent away, and I'm not sure if the bucks understand that or if they're just getting up because they were hunkered down for the storm. But a lot of times, even if you have a small storm, as soon as that's done, you're going to notice that those bucks are up on their feet, freshening up their scrapes. So if it's raining on your property Even if it's a light rain and you can see when it's going to end, try to be in your stand about 15 minutes before that, because you might catch a buck getting up to freshen up his scrape. But that's going to do it for today's video, guys, on a few strategies for hunting during the pre-rut. If you have any other tips, I'm sure everyone would love to hear them. Please drop those in the comment section below, and we will see you guys in the next video.